Welcome, everybody, and happy Wednesday. Welcome to our second episode of the spring semester series of Art Up Close at the BCMA.
My name is Claire Traum. I'm a senior studying art history and minoring in economics, and I'm one of the student representatives to the Museum Advisory Council.
And my name is Lucy Siegel. I'm a junior here at Bowdoin, and I'm double majoring in art history and government. And I'm also a student representative to the Museum Advisory Council. So for those new to the webinar series, Art Up Close is aimed at connecting students with specific artworks in the museum's collections. Each episode features a bite-sized presentation led by a Bowdoin student, art history professor, or museum staff member. We hope you learned something new today, and we encourage you to ask questions in the chat after Frank's presentation. And all 6 previous webinars are posted on Bowdoin's YouTube channel, so we'll drop that link in the chat and check them out.
Great. We are so excited to welcome Frank Goodyear today to present on the photography of Zig Jackson. So I will give a short intro. Frank Goodyear is the co-director of the Bowdoin Museum. He received his undergraduate degree from Princeton University and a master's and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Frank specializes in the history of photography and American art history. He is the author of numerous scholarly essays and 7 books or catalogs, including Red Cloud, Photographs of Lakota Chief, Faces of the Frontier, Photographic Portraits from the American West, American Cool, and Winslow Homer in the Camera. Together with Anne Collins Goodyear and Michael Komanecki, he authored the recent book, At First Light, 2 Centuries of Artists in Maine, Their Homes and Studios. His current research project concerns the photographic work of Marcia Resnick. Goodyear was previously a curator of photographs at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery.
We are thrilled Frank can share some of his photographic expertise with us today. We encourage our virtual audience to engage with Frank and ask any questions you can think of. We will moderate questions after Frank's presentation, and closed captioning is available below. So with that, Frank, take it away.
Lucy and Claire, many thanks. I'm going to share my screen here. My talk this afternoon concerns the photography of Zig Jackson, an artist of Mandan, Arikara, and Hidatsa descent. Jackson is widely regarded as one of the most important Native American photographers working today. Born in 1957 on the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, he was educated at a government Indian boarding school in South Dakota and later at Northeastern Oklahoma State and the University of New Mexico. Over the last 3 decades, his photographs have been especially concerned with contemporary Native American life and longstanding conflicts with the government of the United States and non-Native society. Jackson currently teaches photography at the Savannah College of Art and Design, SCAD, in Georgia. 2 years ago, the museum acquired 6 of Jackson's photographs. The first 2 works that I want to share are from his series titled Indian Photographing Tourist, Photographing Indian. Created in the early 1990s, this body of work investigated with his characteristic acerbic wit the non-native tradition of photographing native bodies. The images here suggest the type of assault, violence endured by native peoples since the advent of photography in the 19th century. The image on the left was created during Crow Fair, a native gathering and powwow on the Crow Reservation in Montana that has permitted non-natives as spectators since its beginning in 1904. The image on the right was created in Taos, New Mexico, at a similar gathering and ceremonial dance among various Pueblo peoples. The series garnered Jackson his first wide critical acclaim. One mark of its success was that the Library of Congress in Washington, which houses one of the largest photographic collections in the United States, acquired a selection of prints from this series. On the one hand, this type of acquisition is not especially remarkable, as the Library of Congress acquires new work all the time and has a large archive of historic images of Native peoples. Yet what made this acquisition notable was that Jackson's series was the first ever by a Native American photographer to enter the library's collection. The library owns literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of images of Native peoples by non-natives. Though until this acquisition in 2005, they had not collected a single photograph by a Native artist. I should note here that the 6 photographs by Jackson that the Bowdoin Museum acquired are also the first photographs by a Native artist to enter the college's collection. These examples of institutional neglect of contemporary Native arts suggest both the paucity of work by Native artists held in museums, American museums, and also the wide gap that exists in terms of who has created images of Native peoples for widespread circulation. In Euro-American society, the image of the Indian has historically been crafted by non-natives, going back to the earliest years of contact. Here I am showing 2 drawings by the British artist John White, who created some of the first images of Native peoples based on direct observation of Native society. His images help to establish the terms by which Native peoples have been pictured over the past 435 years. The story of the historic representation of tribal communities is too long to recite here today, but suffice it to say that these images by John White and those who followed him are often as much an assault on Native peoples, as much a caricature of Native peoples, as the violence enacted by centuries of non-Native politicians, land-hungry settlers, and the US military. Jackson's work wants to intervene in that long history. About his work, he has written, quote, "As a Native artist in contemporary America, I intend my work to be both provocative and educational, carrying an especially urgent message. In one sense, it is intensely personal, yet in another, by virtue of my background and Native roots, as part of an indigenous group struggling for autonomy in the shadow of a dominant group, my work cannot escape an implicit politicism." He went on to continue, in contrast to the seductive and glamorized, or alternately demonized caricatures that thrive in Hollywood and the collective American imagination, my images reveal a far different reality, one of a people in transition, a traditional indigenous culture desperately struggling to survive in the midst of a rapidly changing technological society. These 2 images on the screen right now come from a slightly later series made in the mid-1990s titled Indian Man in San Francisco. In this series, Jackson wears a traditional Plains feathered headdress and had an assistant photograph him in various public spaces around San Francisco, where he lived at the time. On the one hand, these photographs, I think at first glance, elicit a bit of a laugh, as I think Jackson is deliberately fashioning a dramatic persona that disrupts expectations, especially on a city bus in a city like San Francisco. Yet the photographs also make clear Jackson's struggle to maintain his traditional Native identity in a society that works to homogenize difference and that understands Native peoples based predominantly on one-dimensional characters in Hollywood movies and other fictional accounts. In the last pair of images, again created in San Francisco, Jackson poses beside a sign of his own design, made to appear like a traditional highway sign, that reads, "Entering Zig's Indian Reservation." Below, you'll see there's a smaller sign declaring, quote, "private property," and the presence of open range cattle. And also a list of 4 rules, including no picture taking, no hunting, no air traffic, and new agers prohibited. For those not familiar with California in the 1980s and 1990s, a new ager was a term used to describe those who embraced a new holistic form of spirituality, distinct from traditional religions, a movement often associated with California at this time. In this series, Entering Zig's Indian Reservation, Jackson, again in his traditional plains feathered headdress, reclaims lands now owned by non-natives as his own. In one case, sort of the outskirts of San Francisco, the China Basin District, and in the image on the right, City Hall in downtown San Francisco. By declaring the lands, these lands in his own possession, he restakes his relationship with the dominant culture. And by doing so, reclaiming a space for all Native peoples. As you see in these 2 images and in the earlier examples, central to Jackson's artistic practice is the goal of pointing to the historic abuse of Native peoples and the dispossession of both their bodies and their traditional homelands. Yet his work is also about reimagining a world in which tribal communities exercise their own sovereignty. Both satirical and poignant, Jackson's photographs are part of a larger movement in indigenous art circles to reassert Native voices. And maybe in the Q&A, we can talk a little bit more about other artists of Jackson's era who are doing similar kind of work. In closing, we're thrilled to have been able to work with Jackson to acquire these 6 photographs for the museum, and we look forward to including them in a new exhibition, People Watching, Contemporary Photography at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, a project that we hope to open in the next year or so. It all depends on when we're able to reopen the museum to the public. I should also mention that the acquisition of 6 photographs by Jackson is part of the museum's ongoing commitment to expand the diversity of its historic and contemporary collections. We have added some terrific works by Native artists in the last several years and hope to identify, work with, and acquire works by other Native artists in the coming years. I'm, of course, really thrilled to be here and to share this material with the Bowdoin community, and happy to hear your own thoughts and to answer any questions that you might have. Many thanks again for this invitation to speak about the work of Zig Jackson. And at that point, I will stop sharing my screen and we can open it up for any questions or comments.
Well, Frank, thank you so much. That was fascinating. I really like these webinars because I always learn about a piece of the collection that I don't really know anything about, or I've at least never gotten to know a lot of backstory on. So I just really appreciate that. And I can start us off with a question, and I encourage our audience to drop a question or any questions they have in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But just to get us started, I'm wondering a little bit about what specifically were some of the most pressing issues for Native American people in the 1990s, like when these works were being produced, what were the most pressing political or social issues? I guess what the conversation was centered about then.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's always important to contextualize work like this in the period when it was made, and these works are distinctly works from the 1990s, which is a really interesting moment in shifting relations between native tribal communities and the larger non-native society and the American government more generally. And just talk a little bit about some of the really extraordinary legislative accomplishments that occurred in the late 80s or early 1990s. Things like the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1990, that for the first time made illegal the holding of human remains or sacred objects within non-native cultural organizations. It has led to a renewed attention to the collections that have resided in museums over more than a century, and an effort to repatriate those materials to tribal communities. Also, the period in which the National Museum of the American Indian was established. It was President George Bush who signs the legislation for the NMAI that now is been fully built on the DC Mall in Washington. I'm also thinking about this as a period of renewal in terms of economic and cultural revival. It's really in this period that the government permits Native peoples to establish gaming casinos, and so you get the first very controversial idea at the time within non-native society, but the establishment of casinos here in New England, but throughout the country, adds a measure of economic vitality to those communities in important ways. So as much as there's really exciting things that are happening, it's also a period, I think, of continued protest. Protests over everything from athletic team nicknames, protests over land rights and the use of materials found on native lands. A time of increasing national sort of outreach to especially to champion native rights in one measure or another. And Zig Jackson and the work that he produces is all part of, I think, that larger conversation.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing all of that. We have another question. This is about the museum's role as an institution in relation to Zig Jackson's work and other art from possibly native populations and others. Do we currently have sacred objects in the collection, or how do we engage native communities with works in our collection?
Excellent question. The answer is, at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, we do not have any sacred objects. The museum is very careful in inventorying and cataloging its collection. It has a good sense of the artworks that it holds. It is, as I say, a collection that is relatively well researched, and it does not have any of those sacred objects here. That said, there are other museums whose holdings may not have been as well cataloged or inventoried, and they're only just understanding that they have some of these materials. And NAGPRA certainly invited tribal groups into museums to survey the kind of things that museums had collected over the years. And so, institutions from the Smithsonian or Harvard or other places, had human remains in their collections. And it was because of legislation such as NAGPRA that, these collections are recognized and repatriated. In terms of the museum working with Native communities, I think that that's something that we take seriously, and certainly our colleagues over at the Perry McMillan Arctic Museum have been good partners in outreach to local Wabanaki communities here in northern New England. If we are going to go and we are going to collect new work, or we're going to show new work, it really behooves us to have a relationship and be an open conversation with tribal communities in our midst. And certainly when we have acquired work by Native artists, both historic and contemporary, try when all possible to work with this individual artist and to recognize that we as a college museum are looking to add work to our collection by Native artists for educational purposes, and wanting very much their input on the history of those pieces and their significance.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we have a question from the audience actually about specifically the use of photography as a medium. And the question is, what does it mean for Jackson to be addressing these themes specifically using the medium photography? Photography, of course, having a long history with the history of colonization and anthropological documentation / classification.
Great question. So photography is a new form of visual technology that is introduced to the world back in the mid-19th century. And really for the first 50, 60 years after photography's introduction, there are very few, only a handful of cases in which we know Native Americans picked up the camera and took pictures of themselves, their communities, things that were important to them. And so really for the first half century or more, the photographic representation of Native peoples were through the lens of non-Native artists. And these individuals were inevitably outsiders who, though many sympathized with the struggles and of Native communities, they lack the full understanding to the world in which they were picturing, and that their pictures subsequently were used in the larger sort of colonial enterprise of extending sort of American sort of domination across North America. And so it's interesting, in the early 20th century, you get some of the first Native artists who are taking up photography. People like Richard Throssell, a Cree Indian, or Horace Poolaw, a Kiowa Indian from Oklahoma, and who begin to deliberately document their community from sort of a Native perspective. And I think, to make a big question a little shorter, I think that Jackson is working in the legacy of Poolaw and Throssell, wanting to say something about what it means to be Native today. But of course, Jackson is working in the 90s, and he's a long way from the sort of social documentary work of Throssell and Poolaw, and that his work is infused with a sense of humor. There are all sorts of interesting sort of conceptual strains to the work. But I think he's very deliberately chosen photography, recognizing the long history of how non-Native photographers have pictured Native peoples.
Very interesting. I have a quick follow-up. Do you know why he chose black and white for his photographs?
That's a good question. In more recent years, I believe that Jackson has worked in color, but his work from the 90s and the early 2000s was all done in black and white. And I've never had the opportunity to ask him why black and white. Really, color photography, artists don't begin experimenting with color photography in any earnest way until really the 1970s and the 1980s. And, by the time that Jackson would have been in school taking up the medium, black and white still would have been considered, the preferred process by which to create a fine art photograph. So it's really only been in the last 30, 40 years that artists have taken up color in any kind of in earnest way.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, we are so grateful you presented to us today. I think all of us learned a lot, and we are coming up on time. So I think we're going to wrap up the webinar now. But there have been some wonderful comments and questions. So thank you from everyone who attended today and participated with us. And our next episode, please stay tuned. And we put the link in the chat to previous episodes if you want to check them out.
And thank you to Lucy and Claire and also to Elizabeth Humphrey for putting on this wonderful series. It's been a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Have a great afternoon.
Bye.